Every industrial real estate investor remembers their first deal. Some remember it fondly, because it worked. Others remember it as an expensive education. The difference between the two usually isn't luck. It's whether they made one of a small handful of mistakes that show up again and again in nearly every first-time acquisition that goes wrong.
These aren't exotic mistakes. They're not about picking the wrong city or missing some obscure regulation. They're basic, avoidable errors in judgment, the kind that look obvious in hindsight and completely invisible in the middle of a deal that feels exciting. Let's walk through 5 of the most common ones, in the order they usually happen.
Mistake number 1, falling in love with the cap rate and nothing else. A first-time investor sees a listing, 98,000 square feet, fully leased, a 9% cap rate. Compared to the 5 to 6% cap rates common on stabilized industrial assets in most major markets, 9% looks extraordinary. And extraordinary numbers are exactly what a first-time buyer is hoping to find.
But a cap rate is a snapshot, not a guarantee. It's calculated by dividing a building's net operating income by its purchase price, using whatever income exists on the day the calculation is made. It says nothing about whether that income is durable, whether the tenant is likely to renew, or whether the rent itself sits above or below what the space could actually command in today's market.
A 9% cap rate on a building with 18 months left on the lease, an aging roof, and a tenant quietly downsizing is not a bargain. It's a warning wearing a bargain's clothing. Experienced investors learn to ask a different question before they even look at the yield. What has to be true for this income to continue? If the answer involves a lot of optimistic assumptions, the attractive cap rate isn't compensation for low risk. It's compensation for risk the seller already knows about and priced accordingly.
This mistake is expensive in a very specific way. Consider a building purchased for $10 million at that 9% cap rate, generating $900,000 in net operating income. If the tenant doesn't renew and the building sits vacant for 8 months while a new tenant is found, a realistic downtime in a moderately supplied market, that's roughly $600,000 in lost income before accounting for leasing commissions and tenant improvement costs that might run another $200,000 to $300,000 on a building this size. The 9% yield the investor thought they were buying can quietly become a 2 or 3% yield over the first 2 years of ownership once these costs are absorbed.
Mistake number 2, skipping or rushing physical due diligence. This mistake usually comes from a mix of excitement and inexperience. A first-time buyer, eager to close before a competing offer comes in, treats the physical inspection as a formality, rather than as the single most important step before wiring funds. Industrial buildings hide their problems well. A roof that looks fine from the ground can be 5 years past its practical service life. A concrete slab can have hairline cracking that signals settling issues beneath the surface. Older buildings may have environmental liabilities from decades of industrial tenancy, soil or groundwater contamination that doesn't show up on a drive-by tour, but absolutely shows up on a Phase 1 environmental assessment, which every serious buyer should commission before closing, typically costing between $2,000 and $5,000, depending on the property's size and history. A full roof replacement on a 200,000 square foot building can run anywhere from $1.5 to $3 million, depending on the roofing system and regional labor costs. That's not a rounding error. That's a cost that, if discovered after closing instead of before, can turn a solid acquisition into a multi-year drag on returns.
The specific failure here isn't ignorance. Most first-time investors know due diligence exists. The failure is treating the due diligence period as a formality to get through quickly, rather than as a genuine opportunity to renegotiate price, request seller credits, or walk away entirely if something significant surfaces. A properly structured due diligence period, typically 30 to 60 days for an industrial acquisition, exists precisely so that a buyer can uncover exactly this kind of information before they're financially committed. Rushing through it defeats the entire purpose of having it. Mistake number 3. Underestimating how much capital sits behind the purchase price. A first-time investor calculates a budget based on the purchase price and the down payment required by their lender. If the building costs $10 million and the lender requires 30% down, they assume they need $3 million, plus some modest amount for closing costs, and call it done.
What frequently gets missed is the layer of capital that sits behind the purchase price, but isn't part of it. Loan origination fees, typically 0.5% to 1% of the loan amount. Title insurance and legal fees, often running $50,000 to $100,000 on a deal of this size. A capital reserve for near-term repairs identified during due diligence, even if they're not urgent enough to renegotiate over. And critically, a leasing reserve. Cash set aside specifically to cover tenant improvements and commissions if the existing tenant doesn't renew, which, as covered in mistake number 1, is a real possibility that deserves real capital behind it, not just an assumption that it won't happen.
A first-time investor who budgets exactly the down payment and nothing more can find themselves capital constrained the moment anything unexpected happens. A slow lease-up, a repair that can't wait, a tenant negotiation that requires a concession. Experienced investors typically build in a contingency reserve of 5 to 10% of the total capital required, specifically so that an unexpected cost doesn't force a fire sale or a missed loan payment.
Before we move forward to the last 2 mistakes, the ones that tend to catch out even investors who think they've done everything right, if this is helping you think more clearly about industrial real estate, take a second and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing doesn't cost anything, and it directly helps us keep making videos like this one. All right, back to the mistakes.
Mistake number 4. Ignoring the difference between a broker's pro forma and reality. Every listing comes with a pro forma, a projected income and expense statement, prepared, understandably, to make the property look as attractive as possible. This isn't necessarily dishonest, it's simply optimistic by design, because it's a marketing document as much as a financial one.
A common technique in these pro formas is projecting rent at the renewal option rate specified in the lease, rather than at current market rent, even when current market rent is meaningfully lower. Another is understating operating expenses, sometimes by excluding a full year of actual utility costs, or by assuming a management fee well below what a third-party property manager would actually charge. A third is presenting a trailing 12 months of income that happens to be an unusually strong period, without disclosing that the prior year was noticeably weaker.
A first-time investor who underwrites directly off the broker's pro forma without independently verifying the actual trailing income, the actual expense history, and the actual current market rent for comparable space is effectively underwriting the seller's marketing narrative rather than the building's real performance. The gap between a pro forma projection and audited actual performance on a mid-size industrial property can easily run 10 to 15% on the income side alone, which, run through a cap rate calculation, can represent a meaningful overpayment relative to what the building would be worth based on its true verified numbers.
The fix here isn't complicated, but it does require discipline. Request actual trailing 12-month financials, actual utility bills, actual expense invoices, and independent market rent comparables from a broker who isn't representing the seller before finalizing an offer price. It takes more time. It also protects against paying for income that was never really there.
Mistake number 5, underestimating financing risk, particularly around interest rate exposure and loan maturity. Industrial acquisitions are almost always financed with debt, and many first-time investors focus entirely on the initial loan terms, the rate at closing, the amortization schedule, the monthly payment.
without thinking carefully about what happens when that loan comes due.
Most commercial industrial loans are not 30-year fixed-rate products in the way a residential mortgage might be. They typically carry a term of 5, 7, or 10 years, often with a balloon payment due at the end, even though the amortization schedule might be calculated over 25 or 30 years. This means the loan has to be refinanced at some point during the hold period, at whatever interest rate conditions exist at that time, conditions that can be meaningfully different in either direction from what existed at the original closing.
A first-time investor who underwrites a deal assuming their exact current interest rate will still be available at refinancing is making an assumption that has, in recent cycles, proven costly for buyers who didn't stress test it. If rates rise by even 1.5 to 2 percentage points between the original loan and the refinancing date, the new debt service payment on the same loan balance can increase substantially, sometimes enough to push a property's debt service coverage ratio below what the new lender requires, forcing the borrower to either pay down principal with fresh capital, sell the property under time pressure, or in the worst cases, risk default. Sophisticated investors stress test this scenario before they ever close, modeling out what the refinancing looks like not just at today's rates, but at rates 1.5 to 2 points higher to confirm the deal still works, or at minimum, doesn't become unworkable under a less favorable financing environment years down the line. Taken together, these 5 mistakes share a common thread. Each one represents a moment where enthusiasm outran verification. A cap rate that looked too good to fully investigate. A due diligence period that felt like a delay rather than a protection. A budget that assumed nothing would go wrong. A pro forma that was taken at face value instead of independently checked. A financing structure evaluated only at its starting point, not across its full term. None of these mistakes require bad luck to become expensive. They only require a first-time investor moving a little too quickly, trusting a little too readily, or assuming that enthusiasm for a deal is a substitute for verifying it. The good news is that every one of these mistakes is entirely avoidable, and none of them require special expertise to catch. They require slowing down, asking the uncomfortable questions, and being willing to walk away from a deal that doesn't hold up once those questions are answered honestly. If you found this useful, the best way to support more videos like this is simple. Subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you anything, and every subscriber directly helps us keep producing content like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.